Maryland, Our Maryland. Development of the Maryland Land Market, the Colonial Maryland Land Record System. Presented by Massey, the Mid-Atlantic Surveyor Education Institute.
Part 2.
Calvert's interest in companies organized for trade and in the planting of colonies had been awakened very early in his official career. He invested money in both the New England and the Virginia companies, beginning with his investment of £25 in the Second Virginia Company in 1609, and a few months later a more substantial sum in the East India Company, which he increased again in 1614. As early as 1609, he had been a member of the Second Virginia Company and was also one of the provisional counsel for the management of the affairs of the company after the revocation of his charter. He was also one of the 18 counselors of the New England Company in 1622. Now let's look at George Calvert's Newfoundland. Relieved of the burdens and anxieties of public business, which had already seriously impaired his health, Calvert now had at leisure to turn his attention to his interests in the New World. He had long taken much interest in the colonizing schemes, which were so rife at the time, and he associated himself with several, as we said. In 1620, Calvert had purchased the plantation on the island of Newfoundland, and he had sent out a number of colonists with proper implements and supplies, and placed the plantation in charge of a Captain Wynn, whose reports were encouraging. Buildings were erected, land brought into cultivation, seeds and plants sent out from England were doing well. There was nothing to be feared from the so-called Indians, the natives. The salt works were promising. The fishery was the finest in the world. Calvert probably thought that if he had a more definite and paramount authority, he could make Avalon a highly prosperous settlement. So in 1622, he applied for a patent and received a grant for the whole island. This, however, was superseded by a regrant in March 1623, conveying to him the southern peninsula, which was erected in the province of Avalon by a royal charter. By this charter, Calvert was given a palatinate, or quasi-royal authority over the province, which was held in capite by knight service. It's the condition that he was required to provide the king or his successors with a white horse whenever he or they should visit those parts. During the busy years which preceded Calvert's retirement from public life, he had not been able to give much attention to the affairs of his infant plantation, where a master's eye was clearly needed, and his affairs in Ireland occupied him for some time after he retired from his position as Royal Secretary of State. After a 3,700-mile voyage, he arrived for an eyes-on look at his colonial real estate at the end of July in 1627. He took his whole family with him on his ship, the Ark, the same vessel that later brought the Calvert's colonialists to Maryland, first Maryland immigrants. Calvert had come to Newfoundland at the most favorable season and remained for just a couple of months. He liked what he saw that summer. The brief northern summer hid from him the worst enemy of all, the long and brutal Atlantic coast. After his short visit, he returned to England, where he spent the winter preparing for his return to manage the development of his property hands-on, full-time. On a personal note, I visited Newfoundland myself numerous times during my sea duty days on the North Atlantic while serving as a U.S. Coast Guard officer. The Navy's Gentia Naval Base at the head of Palencia Bay on the western side of the Avalon Peninsula was where we always topped off our fuel tanks on our way out to month-long patrols on stations in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and again on our cruise homeward. After a month on station, I can tell you that you wouldn't want to visit a finer place than the beautiful Avalon Peninsula in July and August. Come December, don't be surprised to see snow as high as your shoulders and higher. The damages or discomforts of life at Avalon seemed to have been too much for Lady Baltimore. So she packed her belongings, and with her court, she boarded a ship and sailed another 1,400 miles southward for Virginia, where she remained for some time in Jamestown. Of this we know from a letter that George sent to the Privy Council in London. He asked for letters from the council to the governor of Virginia, instructing him to facilitate Lady Baltimore's return to England. In the same letter, he expressed a grant for land in Virginia, as King Charles had given him leave to choose any unoccupied part. The long and terrible northern winter soon set in, and both Baltimore, whose health had long been weak, and the greater part of his colonists suffered terribly. To add to his suffering, he was forced to see that he had been deceived by false representations, and that his colony, on which he had spent in all almost $75 million in U.S. 2020 dollars, was a failure. So both Baltimore, whose health had long been weak, and the greater part of his colonists suffered terribly. To add to his suffering, he was forced to see that he had been deceived by false representations, and that his colony, on which he had spent in all almost $75 million in U.S. 2020 dollars, was a failure. So now it was anchors away for George, and he set sail on his 1,400-mile jaunt down to Jamestown to join his wife. Me down to New Virginia. But as a papist, a Roman Catholic, he was not welcomed there, so he promptly set sail again on a 2,700-mile voyage back to England.
Rolling home across the sea.
So I wrote a letter to King Charles, who, at the tender age of 25, had succeeded Jimmy Stewart, as king in 1325. Quote, not knowing how better to employ the poor remainder of my days than, with other good subjects, to further the best that I may by enlarging your Majesty's empire in this part of the world, and I am determined to commit this place Newfoundland to the fishermen who are better able to encounter the storms and hard weather, and to remove myself with some 40 persons to your Majesty's dominion, Virginia, where, if your Majesty will please to grant me a precinct of land with such privileges as the king your father, my gracious master, was pleased to grant. The Charter of Virginia having been annulled in 1623, the king had regained his rights, so King Charles could grant to whom he pleased territorial jurisdiction and the possession of all the soil not under private ownership.